A simple act of kindness at a diner in Alaska, a waitress helping a disabled boy eat, sounds like a beautiful scene, right? But what if I told you that this act was the key that unlocked a vault of pain, revealing that the silent and reserved owner of the restaurant, who had been watching from afar, was the father of that child? An absent father, consumed by a guilt that had frozen him for years. This is the story of how the kindness of a stranger forced a man to confront his tragic past and gave a boy the chance to have a full future. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel, like it, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Juneau night descended cold and unforgiving, coating the diner's windows with a thin layer of condensation that distorted the streetlights into moody blurs. Inside, the glacier bite, the smell of stale coffee and French fries hung in the air, a familiar scent that usually signaled the end of another workday for Sarah. The last customer had left, leaving behind only the low hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic drag of Sarah's mop on the linoleum floor. It was a routine, a ballet of tired movements that she knew by heart. But tonight, the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. At the usual table in the corner, Emily sat. Her shoulders, normally hunched under the weight of chronic exhaustion, were strangely stiff. Beside her, little Leo, his legs immobile in his wheelchair, drew invisible circles in a puddle of water on the table, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. The door to Jack's office at the back of the room was closed as always, but it felt like an insurmountable barrier, a silent monument to years of unspoken words. Sarah squeezed the mop into the bucket harder than necessary, the grey water sloshing against her work boots. Her own muscles ached, an echo of the long night that still awaited her at home, caring for Grandma June, whose sleep was as fragile as her health. But her pain seemed trivial compared to the energy that emanated from Emily's desk. For weeks, Sarah had been watching the subtle transformation in her mother. Her initial gratitude, expressed in barely audible whispers, had turned into a look of recognition, and then into a spark of determination Sarah had never seen before. It was like watching a withered plant being watered day after day, first for survival, then for strength to grow. Tonight, Emily's posture was not that of a victim of fatigue, but of a soldier preparing for battle. Her eyes no longer roamed the restaurant in despair. They were fixed, riveted on the dark wood of Jack's office door. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. She didn't know the full story, only the fragments she could piece together, but she knew with a visceral certainty that the nightly ritual of closing the diner was about to be irrevocably broken. To Emily, every hum of the refrigerator, every sweep of Sarah's mop, was like the ticking of a clock, counting down the seconds to the most difficult moment of her life. In her mind, she replayed Sarah's gesture from weeks ago, the way she had folded the napkins, the patience in her voice, the way she had looked at Leo not with pity, but with genuine respect. It had not been a miracle, but it had opened a crack in the wall of despair Emily had built around herself. Through that crack, light began to seep in, and with it a courage she had thought she had lost forever on the icy road years ago. She looked at her son's hands, now resting peacefully in her lap, and then at the door to the office. Behind that door was the ghost who haunted her as much as the memory of the accident. Jack, the man who was a financial presence and an absolute emotional absence. Money paid the bills, but it didn't fill the void next to Leo in physical therapy. It didn't hold his hand during his nightmares. It didn't answer the silent questions in the boy's eyes. Fear was a bitter bile in his throat, but the image of Leo's triumphant smile as he managed to eat on his own was the antidote. Leo hummed an off-key tune, a song he had invented himself, as his fingers glided across the smooth surface of the table. The world, to him, was a tapestry of immediate sensations: the cold of the wheelchair against his legs, the aftertaste of the chocolate milkshake on his tongue, the glow of the lights on the wet floor. He felt the stillness in the air, but he interpreted it as peace. To him, this diner was a place of achievement. It was where Sarah, the girl with the warm smile, had taught him the napkin trick. It was where his mother seemed to breathe a little more deeply. He didn't understand the weight he carried on the shoulders of the adults around him. His disability was simply a fact of his existence, like the color of his eyes or the snow falling outside. He didn't remember what it was like to run. His memory was a blank canvas on which the accident had painted a new reality. Sometimes he saw the sadness in his mother's eyes and the shadow that hung over the man in the office, but those were emotions from a world he didn't yet understand. In that moment, he was just a happy boy in his safe place, unaware that he was the silent epicenter of an old pain about to explode. Inside the cramped office, the smell of paper and stale coffee was Jack's only companion. The week's paperwork was piled on his desk, untouched. His eyes were fixed not on the numbers, but on a faded photograph he kept hidden beneath a stack of invoices. In the photo, a boy of maybe 4, with his same freckles and gap-toothed smile, ran across a green lawn, his arms outstretched to the camera. A Leo who no longer existed. Every detail of the image was a knife in his chest. The scraped knees, the wind-torn hair, the pure, unrestrained joy of movement. He heard the sounds of the diner closing, the bucket, the mop, the soft click of light switches. Each sound was another step closer to the confrontation he feared, and in a masochistic corner of his soul, craved. He was a prisoner in his own diner, a cowardly guardian of the life he had broken. Guilt was a lead jacket, so heavy that some days he could barely get out of his chair, and he knew with a certainty that chilled his bones that the footsteps he heard in the hall now were not Sarah's leaving. They were for him. Emily took a deep breath, and the air that filled her lungs seemed to carry, for the first time in a long time, more oxygen than resignation. It was a conscious breath, an act of physical and mental preparation. She leaned toward Leo, her hair falling over her face, hiding for a moment the storm in her eyes. "Stay here for just a minute, my love. Mommy needs to talk to Mr. Jack," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady, without the tremor she had expected. The nickname, Mr. Jack, sounded strange, a formality that was both armor and weapon. She adjusted the blanket over Leo's legs, an automatic maternal gesture, but her hands were as cold as ice. Every beat of her heart echoed in her ears, a war drum marking the advance. She didn't know exactly what she would say. The words she had rehearsed over countless sleepless nights seemed hollow and useless now. All she knew was that silence was no longer an option. The silence was slowly killing them all. Her with the loneliness, Jack with the guilt, and Leo with the absence of a father he deserved to know, no matter how broken he was. The sound of the metal bucket hitting the floor was what snapped Sarah out of her trance. She had stood in the middle of the room, the mop forgotten in her hands, and watched the scene unfold with painful clarity. She saw Emily's deep breath. She saw the tenderness with which she spoke to Leo and the steely determination that hardened her face immediately afterward. It was no longer curiosity that Sarah felt, but a deep, overwhelming sense of complicity. She was part of this, even without wanting to be. Her simple gesture with the napkins, born of compassion and the memory of her grandmother, had been the rock that started the avalanche. She felt like a spectator in a play whose script she had unwittingly helped write. Instinctively, she moved to the far corner of the counter, giving Emily the space she needed but still remaining visible. It was a silent support, a message that said, "I am here. You are not alone." She began to wipe the counter slowly, a deliberate movement to appear busy, but her eyes never left Emily's figure, who now began her long walk towards that closed door. Emily stood up, her knee joints creaking in protest. Her body held the memory of years of strain, of carrying the physical and emotional weight of her life alone. The few feet between her desk and the door to Jack's office felt like a minefield. Every step a possibility of explosion. The sound of her boots on the linoleum was the only thing that broke the thick silence. Knock, knock, knock. A hollow, lonely sound. She could feel Sarah's gaze on her back, not as a judgment, but as an invisible support that kept her from wavering. She focused on one specific spot on the door, a knot in the wood, dark and circular like an eye watching her. She held on to that detail so she wouldn't look away, so she wouldn't look back and see Leo's innocent face, which might break her resolve. Her mind was strangely empty of thoughts, filled only with the sound of her footsteps and the feel of the blood pounding in her temples. She was no longer the exhausted mother who dragged herself through life. On that short walk, she was the embodiment of courage, born of desperation, a force of nature that could no longer be contained. On the other side of the door, Jack froze. He knew that sound. It wasn't the hurried footsteps of a caterer or the tired thud of Sarah's boots. It was Emily's footsteps, deliberate, relentless. He heard them stop right outside his door and held his breath, his heart, already pounding wildly, now hammered against his ribs like a caged animal. He clutched the photograph in his hand so tightly that the edges crumpled. Leo's smiling face in the photo seemed to mock him. This was it, the moment he had spent years avoiding. He had built the walls of this office, this diner, this secluded life, brick by brick, to protect himself from this very thing. But he knew that no wall was high enough. Guilt always found a crack to get in. He closed his eyes, and the image he saw was not of the office, but of headlights cutting through the darkness, the gleam of black ice on the road, the deafening sound of metal screeching, and the frightened cries of his son coming from the back seat. Sweat broke out on his forehead. He was a coward, and the proof of his cowardice was standing inches away from him on the other side of a thin sheet of wood. Emily's hand rose into the air, pale and trembling in the dim light of the restaurant. For an eternal second, she hung suspended, her knuckles mere millimeters from the surface of the door. Time seemed to stand still. In that unfinished gesture lay all the weight of the past and all the uncertainty of the future. Knocking on that door was easy. Dealing with what would come next was what terrified her. It was admitting that the silent bargain they'd kept, his money in exchange for her silence, had become poison. It was risking the fragile stability she'd fought so hard to maintain. It was forcing a father to face the son he'd broken and perhaps being rejected once again, not with absence, but with words. Leo's face, happy and lost in his own world just a few feet away, flashed through her mind. It was for him. It had always been for him. The hesitation melted away, replaced by a sharp clarity. With a firmness that surprised even herself, she closed her fingers and knocked. 3 knocks. Not loud, not aggressive, just clear, steady, and undeniable. And in the silence that followed, they echoed like gunshots. The echo of the 3 knocks faded away, but the silence that took its place was infinitely louder. It was a deafening vacuum, sucking all the air out of the room. For Jack, inside the office, the silence was confirmation that the world he had painstakingly built to isolate himself was about to collapse. Every second of waiting was torture, a suspense that stretched his nerves to the limit. For Emily outside, the silence was an answer in itself. It was hesitation, fear, proof that he was there and that he had heard her. Her hand still tingled from the impact on the wood, and she held it in the air for a moment, as if afraid that by lowering it, she might break the spell and make it disappear. And for Sarah at the counter, the silence was almost physical. She could feel it like a pressure in her ears, an anticipation so thick that she found herself holding her breath, her eyes fixed on the brass doorknob, waiting, praying for any movement that would free them all from the excruciating stillness. At that moment, the diner was not a commercial establishment, but a stage suspended in time, where 3 souls waited for the inevitable collision. The sound of the knock was the electric shock that revived Jack's body. The paralysis broke, replaced by a cold, sharp panic. Leo's photograph slipped from his sweaty fingers and fell to the table with a dull thud. The boy's smiling face now face down, hidden. In a sudden, uncoordinated movement, he pushed his chair back, the sound of the wheels scraping against the wooden floor. He wasn't thinking, just moving on a primal instinct to flee or fight. He chose the latter, not out of courage, but out of lack of options. There was nowhere to run. The walk from his desk to the door was the longest of his life. Each step was heavy, as if he were walking on the bottom of the ocean. His hand, unlike Emily's, didn't tremble. It was rigid, like a claw, as he reached for the doorknob. He held it for a second, the cool metal against his warm skin, and felt the inner workings of the lock. It was the last obstacle. Turning that doorknob would be like opening the gates to a past he had tried to bury under tons of regret and silence. With a sigh that sounded more like a groan, he turned. The click of the lock was a final sharp sound in the silence. Emily took an involuntary step back as the door creaked softly open. A sliver of yellow light from the office cut through the gloom of the room, and then his face appeared. Seeing him like this, up close after so long, was a physical shock. This wasn't Mr. Jack, the reserved proprietor who gave her distant nods. This was the Jack she knew, or thought she knew. But time and guilt had reshaped him. There was more silver in his hair, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, like ravines carved by grief. What struck her most, though, were his eyes. She remembered them as being filled with a restless, almost feral energy. Now they seemed dull, empty, as if the light behind them had been extinguished. The air between them vibrated, heavy with memories of laughter on summer nights, of plans whispered in the dark, and, inevitably, the sound of breaking glass and a life shattered on a frozen road. In that moment, they were two strangers bound together by the most intimate wound two people could share. When he opened the door, the first thing Jack saw was the strength in Emily's face. This wasn't the same woman he'd left behind, the frightened, heartbroken young woman. This woman had a resilience forged in fire, a determination in her posture that intimidated him to no end. He couldn't hold her gaze. His eyes instinctively darted away over her shoulder and landed on the small figure sitting at the table in the corner. Leo. Seeing him there, under the lights of the diner he'd built as a kind of penance, was like being punched in the gut. The boy was so close, only a few feet away, but he seemed to be in another universe. A happy, innocent universe that Jack had no right to disturb. The image of Leo in the wheelchair, so different from the boy running free in the photograph now turned over on his desk, was a fresh, brutal stab. His entire body screamed at him to close the door, to return to the safety of his self-imposed cell, but his feet remained planted on the floor, paralyzed by the magnitude of his failure as a father. It was Emily who broke the spell. Her voice, when it came, was neither loud nor accusatory. It was low, a little husky, but heavy with the weight of years of rehearsed conversations in her mind. "We need to talk, Jack." She said his name without the "sir" in front of it, and the familiarity of the sound, after all this time, was like a stone dropped into a frozen lake, cracking the surface of his composure. Jack visibly shivered, a spasm rippling through his shoulders. The sound of his own name, coming from her lips, unearthed a flood of memories he fought daily to keep buried. It was the voice that had called to him from across the apartment, the voice that had whispered his name in the dark, the voice that had screamed in panic seconds before impact. The simple words, "We need to talk," were a euphemism for the reckoning he knew he had to face, but had never been prepared to face. He couldn't form a response. The words were stuck in her throat, choked with guilt. Unable to speak, Jack only nodded slowly, a barely perceptible movement of his head. He stepped aside, a silent invitation for her to enter his sanctuary of misery. When Emily crossed the threshold, it was as if she was stepping into his mind. The office was small, claustrophobic, and chaotic. Piles of papers and invoices covered nearly every surface, a fortress of bureaucracy that barely concealed its neglect. The air was stale, redolent of loneliness. Her eyes were immediately drawn to the desk, to the face-down photograph. She knew instantly what it was. That photo, taken by her on a sunny day that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. Seeing that small rectangle of paper hidden there amidst the clutter said more about Jack's state than any words could. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't moved on. He was here, wallowing in memory, as stuck in the past as she was, just in a different way. She felt suffocated, not from the lack of air, but from the density of the pain contained within those four walls. Emily stopped in the middle of the small room, refusing to sit in the visitor's chair he hadn't offered. She needed to stand to keep her strength. She didn't start with the accident or the abandonment. Starting with anger would have been too easy. Instead, she chose the most precise and painful weapon she had: present reality. "He learned to write his name last week," she said, her voice calm and level, as if she were giving a report. "His teacher said he has very good handwriting for someone with his difficulties. He was so proud. He wrote Leo on every piece of paper he could find in the house." She paused, letting the image settle in the heavy air between them. "Last night, he asked why his name was Leo. I told him it was the name we both chose together. And then he asked me why you never visit him." Each word was a carefully measured blow, devoid of hysteria, but loaded with the undeniable truth of her son's life, a life to which Jack was a phantom spectator. Leo's question, recounted in Emily's calm voice, was the final blow. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact, and facts couldn't be denied or justified. Jack's already cracked facade crumbled completely. A guttural sound escaped his throat, a dry, tearless sob. The strength seemed to leave his legs, and he collapsed into his office chair, which spun slightly with the impact. He didn't cover his face with his hands to hide his shame. Instead, his hands fell limply to his sides, and his gaze became vacant, fixed on a spot on the wall. It was the collapse of a man who had spent years supporting an unbearable weight: the guilt, the shame, the fear, the unexpressed love for his son. It all came rushing back, drowning him. The restaurant owner, the reserved man who had kept the world at bay, was gone. In his place was just a broken father, faced with the simplest and most devastating question his son could ask, a question for which he had absolutely no answer. Emily watched him collapse, and her own armor of resolve faltered. She had come prepared to fight, to scream, to cry, to pour out years of pent-up anger and frustration. She had been prepared to face a wall of denial or indifference. But she had not been prepared for this, not for this total, silent surrender. To see him crumble like this, not because of her accusations, but because of the mere mention of their son, was deeply heartbreaking. For a moment, the anger that had driven her here dissipated, replaced by a confused, unwanted feeling, a pang of compassion. She saw through the years of neglect and saw the young man she had loved. Now a haunted man, trapped in an agony that was, in many ways, as profound as her own. The sight of him, so helpless and exposed, did not bring her the satisfaction she had thought it would. Instead, it brought her a deep sadness for both of them, for all they had lost, and for all he had become. Across the room, Sarah watched the half-open office door. She couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language told a telling story. She saw Emily enter, stiff and determined. She saw Jack's figure recoil, then slump in his chair. She saw Emily stand still, her once combative posture now uncertain, realizing that this was the heart of the explosion, her most vulnerable moment. Her protective instincts kicked in. With silent, deliberate movements, she walked around the counter and approached Leo's desk. The boy, sensing her presence, looked up and smiled, a smile pure and unaware of the drama unfolding just a few feet away. Sarah sat in the chair where Emily had been, picked up the cloth napkin that was still on the table, and began folding it into intricate shapes: a bird, a boat, "Let's see if I can make a whale," she whispered, her voice an oasis of calm in the desert of tension. She was creating a bubble of normalcy around the boy, a shield of kindness to protect his innocence from the emotional shockwave that was sure to come. Okay, understood. The story moves on to its emotional core. Here are paragraphs 21 through 30. Standing there in the middle of Jack's office, Emily felt like a tightrope walker, suspended between one chasm of anger and another of overwhelming sadness. The man collapsed in front of her was a stranger, but his suffering was terribly familiar. It was a distorted reflection of her own sleepless nights, her own pain, the fury that had fueled her for so long, that had given her the strength to knock on that door, now seemed like ineffective fuel. What would she do? Yell at him? List all the doctor's appointments he'd missed, all the birthdays he'd forgotten, all the time she'd had to make excuses for other children's questions. Destroying him now seemed as futile as kicking a drowning man. She looked around the small room, at the mess that was a physical manifestation of his inner agony, and knew that he wasn't living in freedom while she suffered. He was in his own prison, a prison of his own making, and from which he had no key to escape. The realization was bitter, taking away her satisfaction of being the only victim. With a movement that seemed both slow and sudden, Emily took 2 steps forward, reached out, and picked up the photograph that had fallen from Jack's desk. Her fingers brushed against a stack of receipts, and the paper felt warm, as if it were absorbing all the heat of his grief. She didn't look at the image. She didn't need to. She knew every pixel of that happy moment. With a gentleness that belied the storm inside her, she set the frame upright, turning it so that it faced Jack. The smiling boy, frozen in perpetual motion of joy, was now looking directly at her. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness or an invitation for comfort. It was a silent command, a brutal and necessary reminder of the heart of it all. This wasn't about her pain or his guilt. This was about the child whose life had been irrevocably altered and who deserved more than 2 ghost-haunted parents. It was a call to accountability, putting the focus back where it should have always been, on Leo. Jack lifted his head slowly, as if his neck muscles had atrophied. His eyes, red and watery, focused on the photograph. Leo's smile hit him with the force of a wave. It was a beacon of a past he could not recover, and a future he felt unworthy of having. He looked from the child in the photo to the woman standing in front of him, the mother of that boy, whose face bore the map of all the years he had lost. A torrent of excuses, justifications, and self-pity threatened to rise in his throat, but died before they reached his lips. He knew they were useless. All he could muster was a hoarse sound, the words breaking as they went. I don't know how," he whispered, his voice weak and broken. It wasn't an excuse. It was the most honest confession he had made in years, an admission of his complete and utter helplessness. He, who ran a business, who dealt with suppliers and employees, did not know how to perform the most fundamental task, being a father. Jack's confession, instead of softening Emily, had ignited a new spark within her. It was the spark of clarity, of practicality forged by years of having to figure everything out on her own. The compassion was still there, but now it was coated with a layer of impatience and realism. "Don't you know how?" she repeated, her voice low but sharp as broken glass. She took a step closer to the desk, bracing her hands on the paper-strewn surface, leaning toward him. "You start by saying, 'Hi, Jack.' You don't need a manual for this. You walk out of this room, over to that desk, and say hi to your son. You ask him about his day. You start by showing up. You start by trying." The words were simple, almost banal, but in this context they were revolutionary. She was dismantling the mountain of guilt and fear he had built and replacing it with a single, small stone, a first step. She wasn't offering an easy path, but she was showing him that there was a path, and that it started with the most basic and terrifying action of all, trying. It's fascinating and terribly human how we can become prisoners of our own mistakes, isn't it? looking at Jack, hunched over in his chair, paralyzed not by a lack of love, but by an excess of guilt. We see a mirror. How many of us have been there, facing a door we feared opening, a conversation we put off for years, convinced that silence is less painful than the possibility of rejection? His story forces us to confront our own self-imposed prisons. We believe that time will heal, or that our absence is a form of protection, when in fact it is just a form of cowardice. What does it take to break this cycle? What does it take to take the first step, no matter how small? If you, reading or listening to this, feel the weight of a past mistake preventing you from connecting with someone you love, perhaps Emily's lesson is for you. Start by trying. Don't wait for a grand gesture or forgiveness that may never come. Start with a hi. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Emily's words, "Start trying," echoed in the office, cutting through Jack's haze of self-pity. Their simplicity was almost offensive, dismissive of the complexity of his grief. And yet, it was exactly what he needed. It was a command, not an apology. Forced to look beyond himself, his gaze traveled through the half-open doorway. He took in the scene at the corner table. He saw Sarah, the waitress he barely knew, bending over her son, her hands moving with a patience he'd never possessed. He couldn't see Leo's face, only the back of his head and the occasional movement of his shoulders as he shifted in excitement. The image was a perfect diorama of everything he'd lost and everything he wasn't. Sarah wasn't paralyzed by Leo's disability. She was engaged with him. She wasn't running away. She was present. The contrast between her simple, effective action and his own tortured inertia was a quiet, devastating revelation. And then a sound floated across the room into the silent office. A sound Jack hadn't heard in years. Not like this. Not in person. It was Leo's laugh, a genuine, clear, happy laugh. It wasn't loud, but it filled every inch of the office, bouncing off the walls of guilt and despair. Sarah had managed to pull off her napkin wail, and Leo was delighted. For Emily, who heard that laugh every day, it was the soundtrack to her life, the sound that kept her going. But for Jack, it was like listening to a foreign language he had once been fluent in. Every note of that laugh was a mixture of pure joy and unbearable agony. It was the sound of life that had gone on without him, living proof that happiness existed for his son, but in a world from which he had willingly exiled himself. The laugh didn't accuse him, it simply existed, making its absence all the more palpable and pathetic. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, a pain so sharp it took his breath away. His son's laughter was the final catalyst. Acting purely on instinct, Jack braced his hands on the table and pushed himself up. His legs shook with the effort, like those of a man who hadn't walked in a long time. He looked at Emily, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, the haze of despair in his eyes began to dissipate, replaced by a faint, uncertain gleam of intention. He had to know. He had to connect, even if it was in the most awkward way possible. His voice came out as a scratch, hoarse with disuse and emotion. Does he like whales? The question hung in the air, so small, so trivial, so ridiculously normal in the midst of the emotional cataclysm. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It wasn't a promise. It was just a question. A tiny, pathetic attempt to bridge a chasm of years of silence. It was the first stone. It was him trying. Jack's question about whales was so unexpected, so out of place, that it took Emily's brain a second to process it. After all the pain, all the drama, all the weight of their history, the first attempt at reconnection had come in the form of a curiosity about a sea animal. And somehow, it was perfect. It was real. A tear she'd been holding back so tightly finally broke free and ran warmly down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of exhaustion, of relief, of a hope so fragile she barely dared to breathe. It was the first time in years he'd asked her anything about Leo that didn't involve doctors or expenses. He'd asked about something that brought the boy joy. She nodded, a short, shaky movement, unable to trust her own voice. When she could speak, it was barely more than a whisper. He loves them, especially humpbacks. He has posters of them all over his room. Humpbacks. Jack repeated the word to himself quietly, as if testing its flavor. Humpbacks. It was new information, a tiny grain of knowledge about the universe that was his son, a universe he knew nothing about. He clung to that word like a shipwrecked man clings to a piece of driftwood. It was something concrete. It was a beginning. Leo's laughter sounded again from the room, and this time the ache in Jack's chest was tinged with a new sensation, possibility. He stared at the open door, which no longer felt like the entrance to a cell, but a threshold into the world where his son laughed and enjoyed humpback whales. Summoning a courage he hadn't known he had, he took a step, just one, a step away from the safety of his desk, away from his prison of guilt, and into the dim light of the diner. It wasn't a solution, nor an absolution, but it was movement. And after years of standing still, movement was everything. Emily watched, her heart in her throat, as Jack took that first, only step. It was a small, almost insignificant movement, but to her it was like witnessing a mountain move. Years of inertia, of a stagnation so deep she had accepted it as permanent, were shattered in that instant. A surge of hope, so intense and terrifying it made her dizzy, surged through her chest. It was a dangerous feeling, this hope. She had spent so long protecting herself from it, building up defenses against disappointment, that now she felt naked and vulnerable. Every fiber of her being screamed at him to keep going, to take one more step, but fear kept her paralyzed. What if he stopped? What if he retreated into the darkness of his office, leaving her with this cruel glimpse of what could be? She stood still in the doorway, no longer a confronter, but a terrified witness, holding her breath and praying to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. Jack's second step was more hesitant than the first. The linoleum floor, slightly sticky from recent cleaning, felt beneath the sole of his boot. The air in the room was different from the stale air in his office. It was cooler, with the lingering smell of food and the subtle scent of Sarah's cleaning product. The sounds were clearer too. He could hear the whir of the ice machine and the distant rumble of traffic on the wet street. It was as if he were emerging from underwater, his senses slowly readjusting to a world he had observed for so long through a thick glass of guilt. He took a third step, and then a fourth, each a monumental battle against the voice in his head that screamed at him to turn back, to hide, to not contaminate the peaceful scene before him with his toxic presence. He walked not like an owner in his restaurant, but like an intruder, a ghost slowly materializing in the world of the living. Sarah felt the change before she saw it. It was a subtle shift in the energy of the room, a drop in air pressure that made her look up from the napkin boat she was trying to create. That was when she saw him. Jack. He was no longer in the doorway of her office. He was in the middle of the room, several feet away, moving toward them with the slowness of a sleepwalker. His eyes met Emily's, who was standing behind him, and the mix of panic and hope on the other woman's face confirmed the magnitude of what was happening. Sarah's protective instincts kicked in. She shifted her body subtly, positioning herself a little more between Jack and Leo, an instinctive human shield. Her mind raced, trying to predict the possible outcomes. She didn't know the story, but she knew the pain. And in that moment, her only goal was to make sure none of that pain spilled over onto the innocent child who was now staring at her napkin whale, completely unaware of the silent earthquake that was shaking the ground beneath her feet. It was Sarah's stillness that made Leo look up. The steady stream of soft chatter and the movement of her hands had stopped. Curious, he followed her gaze and saw Mr. Jack. The man stood there, in the middle of the empty restaurant, looking like a telephone pole in the middle of a field of snow. To Leo, Jack was a peripheral figure in his life. He was the quiet man who occasionally gave him a nod, whose presence seemed to make his mother tense up. He wasn't scary, just quiet. A mysterious adult. Leo watched as the man took a few more slow steps toward him. He didn't feel afraid, just a childish curiosity. Why was Mr. Jack walking so strangely? Why was his mother looking at him like that? In his world, adults' actions were often confusing and illogical. He simply accepted this as one of them, turning in his chair to face the approaching man, the whale-shaped napkin still clutched in his hand, a totem of a happy afternoon. For a long moment, the universe seemed to collapse into that space between Jack and the table. The four characters were frozen in a living tableau of anticipation. Jack, a few feet away, a man on the edge of a cliff, terrified of his next move. Leo, staring at him with open, non-judgmental curiosity, the innocent epicenter of it all. Sarah beside him, a silent guardian, her body tense and ready to intervene. And Emily, in the doorway of the office, a helpless spectator, her heart beating a painful rhythm against her ribs. The air was thick with everything that had gone unsaid for years. Every piece of furniture in the diner, the cracked red vinyl booths, the glass sugar dispensers, the neon clock on the wall, seemed to be holding its breath along with them. Their futures hung on the tip of a needle, entirely dependent on what would happen in the next few seconds. This silence was not empty. It was pregnant with every possibility, from forgiveness to ruin. Jack forced his legs to move again. It was like walking against a hurricane wind that only he could feel. The force of his own shame pushed him back with every step. He kept his eyes down, staring at a scratch in the linoleum floor, using it as an anchor to keep from being swept away by the wave of panic. He didn't look at Leo. Not yet. It was too much. Looking at his son would be like looking directly into the sun. He was afraid the boy's purity would blind him or burn him alive. His hands, which he didn't know where to place them, clenched into fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. The sound of his boots on the floor seemed to desecrate the stillness of the restaurant. Each step was a confession, an admission of his long absence. He wasn't just crossing a physical distance, but trying to cross a canyon of time and pain that he had created himself. Finally, he arrived. The edge of the table acted as a physical barrier, preventing him from advancing any further. He stood there, looming over them, a large, ungainly presence. The silence became unbearable. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. It was Sarah who saved him. Sensing his paralysis, she acted as a mediator, a bridge across the troubled waters. With a calm that belied her own nervousness, she offered him a way out, a safe line of communication. "Good evening, Jack," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Leo was just showing me how he can eat on his own now. He's really good at it." The gesture was immensely generous. She didn't expose him or pressure him. She simply included him in the picture, normalizing his presence and, crucially, praising her son. She gave him a gift, a reason to be there, a safe platform from which he could try to take the next step. Sarah's intervention was the lifeline Jack needed. His gratitude for her was so overwhelming that he could barely register the words, only their gentle tone. But her praise of Leo forced him to do what he feared most. He looked up, and he actually saw his son. Not the baby in the photo, not the accident victim, not the symbol of his guilt. He saw a boy with unruly brown hair that fell across his forehead, just like his own used to. He saw the freckles sprinkled across his nose, an echo of his own, and he saw Leo's eyes, which were not blank or accusatory. They were a deep brown, bright with intelligence and genuine curiosity. In the boy's hand was the napkin whale, slightly crumpled. The crushing reality of his son, a real, breathing, thinking, feeling person right there in front of him, eclipsed the monster of guilt in his mind. In that instant, the ghost that haunted him began to lose its power. following Emily's advice, echoing in his mind. "Start with hello." Jack took a deep breath and tried. His voice came out like gravel, a strange sound in his own ears. "Hi," he managed. The word hung in the air, small and inadequate. Panic rose again. What else? He needed something else. His mind grasped at the only new information he had, the only connection he had. I like your whale." The words were clumsy, the sentence was garbled, but it was all he had. It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't profound. It was the stumbling attempt of a man learning to speak again after years of silence. He didn't apologize, he didn't offer an explanation. He just noticed something his son was holding back. He connected, in the simplest way possible, with Leo's world. Leo looked at Mr. Jack's nervous face, and then at the whale in his hand. He didn't hear the story, the pain, or the monumental effort behind those simple words. He heard an adult trying to be kind. To a child, the intention is often clearer than the words. He didn't see an absent father begging for a second chance. He saw the diner owner who always looked a little sad, saying that he liked his napkin whale. And Leo's answer was as pure and uncomplicated as his heart. A smile spread across his face, lighting up his features. "Sarah made it," he said with obvious pride, holding out the crumpled whale so Jack could get a better look. "She said it looks like a humpback, don't you think?" In that innocent answer there was no judgment, no resentment, not the slightest hint of the past. It was acceptance, a simple, open invitation to enter his world, where the most important things were napkin whales and the people who made them for him. Leo's innocent question, "Don't you think so?" hit Jack harder than any accusation. He was prepared for anger, for resentment, for a wall of silence. He wasn't prepared to be included. He wasn't prepared for a normal conversation. His son's open invitation to participate in his world, a world Jack felt he had lost the right to even observe, was an act of grace so profound that it left him speechless. For a second, panic threatened to overtake him again. What was he supposed to say? How could he respond to something so normal without his voice shaking and revealing the convulsion of emotions that shook him inside? He looked at the tiny napkin whale, an object so fragile and insignificant, and saw in it a lifeline. It was the only point of reference he had in this ocean of unfamiliar emotions. He had to respond. Silence had already cost him too much. Jack swallowed, forcing the moisture down his scratchy throat. He lifted one hand, a slow, hesitant movement, and extended a finger not to touch Leo but to point delicately at the paper figure. "Yeah," he said, and the word came out firmer than he'd expected. He felt emboldened to continue. "Yeah, I think. It looks like a really good humpback. You can see the tail." He was improvising, trying to remember footage he'd seen in documentaries years ago. It didn't matter if it was technically accurate. What mattered was that he was participating. He was validating his son's world. He was nodding, building, adding a small brick to the bridge that Leo had unknowingly begun to span the chasm between them. To Jack's surprise, an even bigger smile spread across Leo's face. He nodded enthusiastically, happy to have his assessment confirmed by the adult. Emily watched from the doorway, and the dam she had built around her heart finally broke. The tears she had been holding back now ran freely, hot and silent, down her face. But they were tears of a kind she had not felt in a long time. They were tears for the aching beauty of this moment, tears for the innocence of her son, who saw no sin or guilt, only a man interested in his whale, tears of grief for the thousands of little moments like this that had been stolen from them, and to her astonishment, tears of fierce, overwhelming hope. To see them there, connected by a piece of napkin, was more than she had dared to dream. With a movement that mirrored Jack's moments before, she stepped out of the shadows of the office and into the light of the diner, moving slowly toward the table, toward her rebuilding family. Sarah watched the exchange with quiet wisdom. She saw Jack's outstretched finger, heard his husky voice agreeing about the whale, saw Leo's radiant smile, and finally saw Emily's silent tears and her step toward the table. She understood that her role here was complete, at least for now. The bridge she had helped build was now being crossed. To remain here would be an intrusion. With remarkable sensitivity, she found a way to withdraw gracefully. "Well," she said, rising slowly, her voice calm and casual. "My shift is really over now. I need to get home. Grandma June should be waiting for me." She placed a gentle hand on Leo's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. She gave Emily a barely perceptible nod, a gesture of sympathy and understanding. And then she looked at Jack, and her gaze was clear and direct, a silent message of encouragement. "Don't screw this up." Sarah's departure changed the dynamic of the room once more. The soft sound of her footsteps retreating, followed by the familiar jingle of the bell attached to the front door as it closed, was a sound of finality. The outside world, with its snow and distant lights, was sealed off. The diner, which had been a semi-public space moments before, became a private sanctuary. The buffer, the gentle mediator, was gone. Now it was just the three of them, Emily, Jack, and Leo. A mother, a father, and a son, alone together for the first time in years. They were in a bubble, suspended in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the tense silence of before, or the silence broken by laughter. It was an expectant, fragile silence, full of the potential of what was to come next. They were at ground zero, the beginning of a new map that they would have to draw together. Leo, always attuned to the emotional currents around him, even if he didn't understand them, felt the shift. He glanced at the empty seat where Sarah had been, then at his mother, who was now standing near the table. He saw the wet trails on her cheeks, glistening in the diner lights. He tilted his head, his expression one of pure curiosity. The complexity of the moment was invisible to him. All he saw was his mother crying. With the straightforward logic of a child, he asked the most obvious and yet the most profound question. "Mom," he said, his voice small in the silent space, "are you crying?" The question hung in the air, directed at Emily, but it was to Jack that the answer truly mattered. This was the final test of the night. Emily reached out and wiped her face with the back of her hand, but the tears were replaced by new ones. She looked at Jack, a long, meaningful look that held years of pain and a second of forgiveness. Then she knelt beside Leo's wheelchair so she could look him in the eye. "I am, my love," she whispered, her voice cracking but clear. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her teary eyes. "But don't worry, they're good tears. Sometimes adults cry when they're really, really happy." Saying those words, associating happiness with that scene, with Jack's presence, was the greatest gift she could give them both. It was a declaration, a permission. It was her saying to Jack and to the universe that she was willing to let happiness in again, even if it hurt. Tears of happiness. Emily's words hit Jack with the force of a revelation. Never in his wildest confrontational scenarios had he imagined hearing those words. He had expected shouting, accusations, perhaps a silent, undying hatred. But happiness, the idea was so foreign, so undeserved, that he felt a surge of gratitude so powerful his knees felt weak. He looked at Emily, kneeling beside his son, and saw her not as the woman he had hurt, but as the incredibly strong person who had held his family together. In a move that seemed to seal the unspoken agreement for the night, he walked over to the table, pulled out one of the red vinyl chairs, and sat down. The sound of the chair legs scraping against the floor was a sound of surrender. He was no longer standing, hovering. He was no longer the owner or the outsider. He was sitting at the table. He was claiming his place. And so, under the warm lights of an empty Alaskan diner, a family began to have their first conversation in nearly their entire lives. It wasn't dramatic. They hadn't solved all their problems. The scars hadn't faded. But Jack, now sitting, looked at Leo and asked a second question. Emily said you have posters of whales in your room. Leo perked up instantly. Yes, I have an orca and a blue whale, but my favorite is the humpback because they sing. Do they sing? Jack asked, genuinely interested. Yes, Emily said, her voice still moist, but with a lightness that hadn't been there in years. He can show you the videos. They sound amazing. They kept talking about whales and school and how the milkshake tasted. They were small words about small things, but in the fragility of that awkward conversation, something vast and powerful was being built. A new foundation, brick by brick. Their journey, of course, was just beginning. Healing from such a deep wound does not happen overnight. But in that diner, under the invisible aurora borealis of new hope, the hardest step was taken. Their story reminds us that redemption is not a magical event, but a process. It begins with one person's courage to confront pain, another's empathy to provide a path, and one broken man's willingness to finally try. How many bridges in our own lives remain unbuilt because we are afraid to take the first step? How many conversations are stuck in throats constricted by guilt? The lesson of that cold night in Alaska is universal. Find your napkin whale. Find that small, awkward, authentic point of connection and dare to use it. Don't wait for the pain to go away before you start living. Life is happening now. Share this message of hope. Show the world that the future does not have to be held hostage by the past, and that the longest and most important journey always begins with a single, courageous step. She didn't want to change the world. She just wanted a boy to be able to eat his snack, and in doing so, she ended up giving humanity back to a man who lived like a ghost. Oftentimes, we are so focused on our own pain and guilt that we become blind to the people around us, even those we love the most. We build walls, hide behind closed doors, forgetting that healing rarely happens in solitude. The lesson of Sarah, Jack, and Leo is a powerful reminder that sometimes all it takes is for someone to truly see us, beyond our flaws and our sadness. If this story made you reflect, as it did for them, subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire us to make the most important difference of all, seeing others with our hearts.